So here's a few thoughts of the ways our dogs might affect wildlife. The big one that everybody obviously probably thinks about first is disturbance. Just a few examples. In winter can be particularly an issue because animals and birds are struggling to have enough food, or their body weight can be lost significant proportion, up to a third overnight for many birds. And the cold is getting to them, particularly when it's wet, so they need more food, and it can be particularly hard for them to find food. At breeding time, they're obviously a lot more sensitive, particularly birds that are ground nesting. A dog running around can cause big damage, and obviously some situations the dogs will even eat the eggs of the ground nesting birds. Equally, if you've got larger animals than being chased, can cause them to abort. So that can be important, and that equally is true of farmed livestock. As the other one that I think people often don't think about is disturbance to crops. So crop damage can be quite significant. Allowing your dog to run around in a field of wheat is great fun to watch, and watching the dog jumping up and down, throwing its head above the wheat. But think about the damage that can cause to the crop. It can make the crop lie down, which makes it harder for the harvesters to pick it up. Equally, they might go to the toilet in the crop, and then you've got dog dirt in amongst what could be food, or is particularly an issue when you're very close to harvesting something like hay. You then end up with dog muck in the hay bales, and it can be quite horrible. If you're in an area with a lot of dogs, that can be quite impactful. And then you've got things like the dogs may be eating, as I said, the eggs of ground nesting birds, but they also might be eating carrion, things that carry disease, so it can work both ways. So disturbance is a lot more than just your dog running around. And we'll talk about it again with water, but a dog jumping in a pond can be a particularly profound effect on the animals and plants that live in that pond. So one of the other key ones I wanted to talk about was the impact on water. I know our dogs love to run in, and it's great fun watching them jumping around in the water and having fun. And I certainly wouldn't want to stop that happening. But it is worth thinking about where. The obvious one is obviously if there's some birds out on the water, then could be seriously disturbed by the dog, particularly again in winter or in breeding season. But maybe the ones you don't necessarily think about is the impact of what happens under the water. And less so in a big lake like this with a gravel shore. Probably not too big an impact. So this pond behind me is a good example of where I wouldn't normally let my dog in. And the reason is because it's a really important little habitat. You can see there's lots of bogbean in the water that would get disturbed. There'll be lots of insect life living on those, living on the reef behind. There's some quite valuable marsh edge habitat where again there could well be insects, and in the summer and spring you'll often see dragonflies and lots of other things here. I also know for a fact that there's otter come through this spot, and it's an important little area for wildlife as a breeding ground, as a feeding ground, and the dog jumping in and out of there will very quickly start to damage that habitat. The disturbance of the silt can kill certain animals, or certainly damage them, or make it harder for fish to feed because they can't see. Or it can actually, if the waters are at all flowing, act a bit like sandpaper. The sediment is hitting the fish, and it's like having sandpaper running over their bodies. It can be really devastating. So not just in a pond, but actually in flowing water.